Having spent a couple weeks playing Sonic Superstars, it's finally time to sit down and share my thoughts and findings on the game. As a longtime fan, I always approach these new releases with some amount of trepidation. But I was excited to see what Sonic team and developer Zest had come up with. Turns out, what's here is pretty good, and pays tributes to Sonic's past while exploring new concepts along the way. Yet, it's also a game that makes some curious design choices, which we'll discuss. Perhaps even more fascinating, however, are the technical decisions made in building this game. This Unity-powered platformer is a prime example of the price of 60 frames per second in action, specifically when talking about the Nintendo Switch version of the game. So today we're going to explore Sonic Superstars both from a game design and visual perspective while weighing in on the different versions of the game across multiple platforms, especially on Switch. So let's begin. At its core, Sonic Superstars promises a return to the classic side-scrolling Sonic formula, but constructed entirely in 3D. We've seen this before with varying levels of success, including the classic Sonic stages built for Sonic generations. But even at its best, Sonic in 3D has always struggled with one thing: control physics. Yes, the original Sonic games are known for their specific brand of acceleration and momentum, the way Sonic interacts with slopes, loops, and other terrain features, something key to both its design and appeal. Problem is, after the 16-bit games, this aspect of Sonic was largely lost, with both 2D and 3D attempts failing to deliver anything remotely comparable to the original games. Which is why Sonic Mania was such a revelation. Christian Whitehead and his team perfectly nailed the feeling of playing Sonic, even expanding upon the moveset with the drop dash. It was the first time that Sonic felt truly right since the 16-bit era. For this reason, I was a little nervous about Superstars. On paper, the development sounds like a dream. It's a collaboration between Sonic Team and Zest, a studio formed by Sonic's character designer Naoto Oshima, along with other Sega veterans. Alas, their reputation isn't exactly sterling, with titles such as Balan Wonderworld and Yoshi's New Island under their belts. Yet after playing Superstars, I'm gonna say it, this is the best game Zest has ever worked on. But is it a truly great Sonic game? So the thing about movement in a Sonic game, a 2D Sonic game specifically, is that you need to get the acceleration curve, arc of the jump, the interaction with slopes, and everything else related to movement just right, if you want it to feel like Sonic. That's what makes these games fun to play. Of course, while crucial, controls are not the only element that matters. A great side-scrolling Sonic game should feature multi-tiered level design that rewards skilled players and multiple playthroughs. The low, medium, and high paths and the ability to move between them seamlessly is critical. Boss fights then should be snappy and allow skilled players to finish them off at their own pace. Moreover, Sonic also requires an attractive, bold visual design, running at a smooth 60 frames per second of course, and a catchy, memorable soundtrack. Now, you can still have a fun game without nailing every element, mind you. I think the 2D stages from Sonic Generations demonstrates this well. The controls lack nuance and precision, while the stages are often too straightforward. But at the same time, the sense of speed, the presentation, and the general sense of fun is still intact. It's just not on par with the best of the series, and it's a trap many post-95 Sonic games fell into. So the question for this video then is, where does Sonic Superstars stand, and does it hit all the right buttons? Well, first and foremost, Superstars plays like a proper 2D Sonic, and I mean it. It has the same acceleration model, the same physics, and similar jump heights. I was genuinely surprised by this, as no other polygon-based Sonic game has ever pulled this off. I mean, really, it has never happened before. At least not officially anyways. I mean, you try rolling out of a slope in Generations, then try it in something like Superstars. The difference is immediately apparent. Getting these fundamentals right is so critical to Sonic, and they did manage it with this game. Then there's the level design. I can't say I loved every stage in this game, at least not as much as something like Sonic Mania. But the team did an admirable job at capturing this aspect as well. The stages do genuinely offer multiple routes determined by your performance. The stages are large both horizontally and vertically. This means that they've largely done away with the cinematic flourishes of games like Sonic Generation and its ilk, and I think it's a largely positive thing. These stages require genuine platforming skills. You can't just hold right and boost through it. Conversely, if you're someone that likes those boost style games, you might actually find these level designs a little bit disappointing, which opens an entirely different can of worms, but let's stay focused for now on the classic games. The other thing about level designs in a Sonic game are the in-stage mechanics. You know, the gadgets and gimmicks that Sonic encounters on his way to the end. Superstars has these as well. A great example is Press Factory with its hydraulic machinery slamming against the stage at fixed intervals. Each time it hits the ground, it sends you flying through the air if you happen to be touching the floor. It feels fresh and fun. There's familiar mechanics as well, such as those in the Pinball Carnival Zone. And there's even some throwbacks to things like the Game Gear version of Sonic 2, as we see in Lagoon City. Alas, not every mechanic is a triumph. I dislike the fog circle that follows you around through much of Speed Jungle Act 2, for instance. It just limits the view and it looks kind of ugly. Cyberstation is another example of this. It's interesting conceptually, but it's not that much fun to replay. There are some fun gimmicks later in the game though, such as a Fantasy Zone inspired stage, which perfectly mirrors the actual gameplay of Fantasy Zone, including a pair of bosses. It's really cool. The final stage also brings time manipulation into the mix, so there's definitely some cool stuff here. So while it's not perfect, I think they've done a pretty good job in this area overall. The point is, the stage design is largely excellent, which combined with the controls makes for a very faithful and enjoyable Sonic experience. Unfortunately, there is one big caveat that can spoil the fun slightly. It's the boss battles. The thing about Sonic boss fights is that I've always felt that they're at their best when daring players to get in there and get your hits in. Yes, there may be patterns and things to dodge, but usually if you're aggressive you can take down a boss quickly. It's just long enough to be fun and it keeps the pacing brisk. With Sonic Superstars, however, the designers seem to have misunderstood this aspect, or at least decided to do something new, and the boss fights wind up being way too frequent and too drawn out. So basically each act has a boss battle, which is something we started seeing in Sonic the Hedgehog 3, with a mid-boss fight followed by an Eggman battle at the end of Act 2. Problem is, the mid-boss fights now take as long or longer than a typical Eggman battle, and the Act 2 bosses are just way too long for their own good in many cases. Each boss starts off with a lengthy cutscene, which you can skip thankfully, followed by a battle of waiting. You see, bosses typically only reveal their weak points for a brief moment, requiring the player to often wait for long animations to play out before getting a hit in. If you miss during that window of opportunity, guess what? You've got to wait for the animation to play again. As a result, these fights can last for minutes, nearly as long as the stage itself. You can sometimes get in those extra hits, but it just never feels quite as satisfying as I'd like. And that's a shame because there are some fun boss battles in here, but the length means that replaying these stages often feels a little bit tedious and drags down the pacing of the game. It really is my single biggest complaint with the overall game design. They've also included character-specific bonus levels, some of which are fun, others perhaps less so. There's multiplayer too, which honestly didn't do much for me. Cooperative play is a little bit too chaotic, and the online multiplayer is, well, strange. I'll talk more about this when we get to the performance section, however. So, in contrast to other side-scrolling Sonic games, the core game in level design in Superstars fares pretty well. The play mechanics largely feel excellent and authentic, while most, but certainly not all, of the level designs are good to great. The long boss battles in certain levels can let you down, especially when they drag on way too long, but it's still a proper Sonic game in a way that I didn't really expect. Next, however, let's move on to the visuals and audio. Firstly, as is obvious by this point, Sonic Superstars is a 3D game, but viewed from a side perspective with movement on the X and Y axis. It's a side-scroller basically. Since 2008, Sonic Team has traditionally utilized its internal Hedgehog engine when creating 3D Sonic games, but for Superstar, our Zest has opted for Unity instead. Perhaps they didn't even have access to the Hedgehog engine, as it's an internal tool. Unity, though, can be a great choice for multi-platform games like this, arguably better than Unreal Engine when factoring in the Switch, and I think the Switch version may have served as a foundation for this game's visual design. I wouldn't be surprised if Arzest took an approach similar to, say, Playtonic when creating Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, namely building the game with an eye for 60 frames per second on the least powerful platform, which is Switch. And in terms of overall visual design, I think they've largely done a good job with this. The foregrounds are sharp and legible, with bold colors and clear shapes. They're not pushing huge volumes of detailed polygons or anything, but it works well enough in most stages anyway, and retains the classic abstract designs you expect from a Sonic game. The backgrounds, however, I might describe as more performant, if you will. Geometry is only used sparsely, but most of the backgrounds rely on flat textures, billboards basically. The benefit here is that with the way the layers are assembled in many stages, they're able to simulate the multi-layered parallax scrolling effect that Sonic is known for. On most platforms, depth of field blur is deployed with the intent to draw the player's eye to the game's foreground. I think it looks great, and it's not just a simple Gaussian blur either. It almost simulates the look of bokeh depth of field, at least to some degree, even though it's clearly a much cheaper solution. Character rendering and animation is also absolutely wonderful. Sonic and friends are detailed, expressive, and well shaded. While displayed at full frame rate, the animation itself matches the posing and keyframes from his 2D adventures, which ensures, along with the controls, that the game feels great. Alas, the presentation isn't always perfect. In some zones, the background can feel a little sparse, with obvious 2D elements detracting slightly from the effect, especially in the Switch version. And with that in mind, perhaps it's time we do talk about the differences between the different versions and how it impacts this visual design. So for this video, I'm looking at the game on PlayStation 5, both Xbox Series consoles, the PC, and of course Switch. But it also exists for last generation consoles. Based on my testing, all versions except the Switch largely share the same visual quality, with the primary change centering on resolution. PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X deliver a full native 4K experience, while Xbox Series S is just 1080p native. All versions aim for 60 frames per second, and as noted, they all use the same detail settings. The Switch version, however, is the obvious outlier here, and an interesting case study. Some of the decisions made for the Switch version make a lot of sense, while others left me a little baffled, so let's get into that comparison. I first started the game playing in portable mode, and I admit I was impressed with the experience. It looks extremely vibrant and smooth on the OLED model, and even delivers a full native 720p output, which is a match for the Switch's screen resolution. Curiously, there is no dynamic resolution scaling, but at least a couple stages run at a sub 720p resolution, so it's defined on a per stage basis. Then I loaded it up in docked mode, and reality came crashing down. A lot of sacrifices were necessary to get this to 60 frames per second, and while I think that's ultimately the right choice, the sacrifices have a profound impact in this mode. Firstly, even when docked, the resolution seems to top out at 720p, so it doesn't actually look great on a large 4K display. Furthermore, texture resolution is cut down significantly, perhaps even quarter resolution or worse in select cases. Surfaces are largely blurry, missing a ton of detail on Switch, while texture filtering is also poor, leaving certain angles completely devoid of any detail at all. Now, a drop in texture detail isn't exactly unexpected for the Switch, but the result is somewhat inconsistent. Some levels still look great, but others lose way too much detail. Even still, it wouldn't be too bad if not for another major sacrifice, the depth of field blur. Without the depth of field enabled, the backgrounds are in full view. This is also an option on the PC version, by the way, but on Switch, the need to reduce texture quality has a significant and highly negative impact. It's not that bad in some of the early stages, but the further you play, the worse it gets. On top of this, lighting is cut way back across the board, the bloom effects are completely gone, and things like fogging and atmospherics are absent too. In Speed Jungle here, when you pare back the texture detail and remove those atmospherics, it just looks flat and ugly. Furthermore, in the Switch version, Sonic has no shadow, so he doesn't blend well with the environment, Look closely around his feet, you can see what I mean. And on top of that, water appears opaque in the Switch version, so all those beautiful waterfalls that you see in the first stage lose much of their luster. This shot also demonstrates that the wooden bridge features a lower polygon count on Switch, which holds true for many other objects throughout every level. I really think certain elements could and should have been done better. The loss in texture detail is often just a bit too much. Zones like this just wind up looking awful on the system. Putting a giant low-resolution billboard this close to the foreground just doesn't work. I do think the Pinball Carnival zone fares a little bit better. The background still looks okay here on Switch without the depth of field. But if you look closely at the foreground texture work, it kind of reminds me of Rage, id Tech 5 textures that haven't fully loaded in. Yet despite all this, I still think they made the right decision. Cutting the visuals back to reach 60 frames per second is a necessity for this game. This is the price of 60 frames per second. Seriously, if this is what it takes to reach that target on the Switch, so be it, as the game plays very well even with its reduction in visual quality. Heck, when played in portable mode, it actually looks pretty good too. It's really just the docked mode that suffers. Of course, whether they've done a great job with this kinda depends on how stable the frame rate is though, doesn't it? So firstly, the PlayStation and Xbox versions of the game do seem to deliver a stable 60 frames per second. I played through the entire game on PS5 and about half the game on each Xbox console, and found that performance was largely a non-issue. Of course, there are areas where it can drop frames, such as the end of the first stage here. Basically when the screen is flooded with too many alpha transparency effects, and both Xbox Series X and PS5 drop frames at exactly the same place. Curiously, with its much lower 1080p resolution, the Series S does not drop frames in this scene. By virtue of this, the Series S might have the best performing console version of the game. Oh, and this small drop here, that's actually caused by the flash to white that occurs in every version. It's not actually a dropped frame. The Switch version does pretty well for itself, especially early on, when it comes to hitting the 60 FPS target. Most levels run without issue at a full 60 frames per second, just like the other versions. There's occasional hiccups here and there, mind you, but it's very smooth overall. Even the section at the end of Stage 1 runs better on Switch, though it's simply because they got rid of the splash effects. But unfortunately, it's not perfect. Any sequence with too many characters or objects on screen can incur a drop, as we see here. The first half of the game feels nearly perfect, but these problems become more frequent over time. Though even during the first half of the game, there's situations like this where the frame rate just sort of drops below 60 for no obvious reason. I say obvious because once you continue, it's clear that it's due to this breakable wall here, but still, it feels kinda sloppy. Given the visual cuts, I do think this aspect is genuinely a disappointment and suggests that they just barely managed to hit their frame rate target. The worst sections on Switch though typically appear during boss battles, specifically some of these later fights. This battle in particular feels especially bad as the frame rate struggles to cross the 50 FPS line throughout. And then later on there's another battle which also exhibits performance issues, though this one's perhaps not quite as bad as the previous example. Then there's this whole online multiplayer mode, which just runs like garbage on Switch. I'm not really a huge fan of this mode to begin with. You basically matchmake with others and run around completing various objectives. As far as I can tell, I only ever matched into rounds with bots, so I don't think anybody's even playing it right now. But when you combine the visual cutbacks with this very unsteady frame rate, it's just something not worth playing, especially on Switch. Another aspect of performance I wanted to touch on are loading times. All SSD-based systems load the stages very quickly, as you'd expect. I did not get a chance to try the last-gen versions on mechanical hard drives due to time constraints, but for this video, the Switch is the one I was most curious about. And loading times are indeed significantly longer, but not so much longer as to detract from the experience. Crucially, the special stages all load relatively quickly on Switch, something that could have really spoiled the game flow, but thankfully it's pretty reasonable. But there's another more hidden aspect of performance I want to discuss as well, and that's input lag. Essentially, each version of the game exhibits a difference in terms of input response. You know, the time from when you press a button to when your character reacts. Surprisingly, the Switch version manages to feel the most responsive of all the console versions. It's extremely snappy and feels absolutely on par with games like Sonic Mania. The PlayStation 5 version is also very responsive, but perhaps slightly less responsive than the Switch. It's close, but slightly heavier overall, I found. Unfortunately, the Xbox version is slower still, and this one is baffling. The game is perfectly playable, mind you, but Sonic feels a lot heavier when moving and jumping. And the weird thing is, if you press something like the start button to bring up the menu, that's responsive, but the actual character movement is extremely laggy. It just doesn't feel as nice to play as the other versions. I have no idea what they've done here, but it's definitely something that needs to be patched. For my money though, the best version to play is the PC version. Not only is it the most responsive version of the bunch, but it also supports 120 frames per second. For me, that alone is a game changer and results in an experience that feels unbelievably smooth and responsive. I don't have the hardware necessary to capture this, mind you, so I'm using Nvidia Share, but rest assured, it feels very smooth. That said, some users did note that trying to rev up the spin dash using multiple buttons doesn't work properly at 120 FPS. I don't use the technique myself, but it basically means you can't rev up your spin dash as fast as some users would like, so that's worth noting. Still, aside from this, at 120 FPS, the PC version just feels more responsive than any other version, and loading times are insanely fast. But the best reason for choosing the PC version has nothing to do with the graphics. Instead, it ties into the final point of this discussion, the sound. So I recently discussed the importance of a great soundtrack in a platform game in my Super Mario Wonder video. And yeah, music has always been a huge part of the Sonic series. Superstars, however, arrives in a curious state. The soundtrack has an identity crisis. First impressions are strong enough, the opening stage theme is amazing. Then you have tracks like Speed Jungle, and Pinball Carnival. Among numerous others. Most of my favorite tracks were composed by either T. Lopes or Rintaro Soma. Unfortunately, hiding behind every great track in the game is the ghost of Sonic 4. That's right, this game features a surprising number of tracks that sound a lot like that game. But what's the problem with Sonic 4? Well, it really comes down to instrumentation and production. Essentially, with Sonic 4 and many of the tracks in Superstars, the composer seems to have relied on a drum sample designed to replicate that Mega Drive sound. None of it sounds authentic, and the tracks kind of fall flat as a result. When I reached this climactic battle with Fang late in the game, I was astounded that they opted to use this ultra short, repetitive, nasty sounding loop. Frankly, it sucks. In fact, thinking about it, I realized that some of my issues with the lengthy boss battles stem from the music. Sure, there are some good melodies here, but the actual instrumentation is terrible. Which brings me back to the PC version. You see, on PC, Superstars can be modded, and that includes the soundtrack. There's pre-made packs like this, as well as instructions for making your own music swaps, but the key is, you can redefine the tracks you don't like to create a more coherent soundtrack. So let's hear some examples. Remember that Fang battle from earlier? Well, here's an example of what's possible with modding versus the actual original tune. I think that sounds a lot better. But if you don't like that track, you can change it to whatever you want. How about another example then? Heck, you can even apply this to things like the game's menu system. The main menu, for instance, sounds like this by default. Which I felt could be improved. Alright, so maybe I've come out swinging here, but it really highlights to me how important the soundtrack is for a Sonic game. It's very frustrating in this case, as roughly 70% of the soundtrack is top tier. I love it. Yet that remaining 30% just doesn't work at all. Here's the thing though, there are arrangements of other songs in the game that sound like Sonic 4. You can hear this in the game's credits theme, for instance. Which makes me wonder, was Sonic Superstars originally intended to sound like Sonic 4? If so, why? Did they make a late decision in development to create new arrangements of these tracks and simply ran out of time before completing the full soundtrack? It's really not clear, but hopefully in the future, for any other games like this, they do not go back to the Sonic 4 well. It's a bad idea. But okay, we're nearly finished with this video, so let's wrap things up, shall we? So the first thing here, if you're looking at this game and think, that looks pretty fun, but I've always struggled with Sonic, I have a tip for you. Always be rolling. I mentioned this after seeing folks struggle to play Sonic only to constantly get hit and lose rings. I can see why this would be frustrating. You can't always anticipate enemy placement, but anytime you start to pick up speed, simply hold down on the D-pad and you'll not only gain additional speed, but you'll roll right through most enemies. Furthermore, when platforming gets tricky, just try to let the momentum carry you and keep moving. Sonic was marketed on speed, but sometimes you need to just go with the flow. As for my final thoughts on the game though, I wasn't initially feeling it all that much, but the more I've played and replayed the stages, I've come to realize that I do in fact enjoy playing Sonic Superstars. In fact, I love it. It's not Sonic Mania, but it's easily the second best official side-scrolling Sonic game to come out of Sega since the 16-bit days. Yeah, it has its flaws for sure, but crucially, it feels great to play, and I'm so happy they've finally established that solid base of mechanics again. Most of the level designs are great, there's great music in here, I love the visual design. Yeah, certain versions have caveats such as the visual hit on Switch and the input lag on the Xbox versions, but still, I'm overall very happy with how the game turned out, and I hope they decide to build on this one in the future. Anyways, thanks for sticking with me to the end of the video. I hope you found something entertaining and useful within. But that's gonna do it for now, so we'll see you next time.